There we
Good
go.
morning.
So
Good
welcome
morning.
everybody to a presentation by Daniel Wegener, and he's going to introduce himself and his topic, and the floor is his.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Daniel Wegener. I've been an educator since 1971. I've been a Baha'i since 1969, and my career as an educator and an administrator has been focused on supporting my language minority students and the promotion of critical thinking skills. So the overall context for this presentation and my work was the Baha'i Principle of the independent investigation of truth. If individuals are lacking in what Dan Jordan used to call process skills, or what I call critical thinking skills, it's very unlikely that with the complexity of the world we live in today, individuals are going to be able to truly pursue independently the investigation of truth. And the fact that, from my point of view, the educational establishment globally has failed miserably in the last 60 years in teaching critical thinking, all you have to do is look around the world and see what's happening with the ease with which public opinion can be manipulated, the ease with which individual beliefs and behaviors can be manipulated by a variety of actors. And so I continue to have a deep concern for what we have not done in public education. ANISA and the ANISA model did not, to my knowledge, focus directly on critical thinking skills, but Dan Jordan and his colleagues did have a very strong interest in process skills. And throughout my educational career, I've seen a consistent neglect of process skills, and instead what I would consider an overfocus on content skills. And that's part of what has led us to where we are today in the world, and the degree to which critical thinking and the independent investigation of truth seems to be lacking. My educational journey started in 1968 when I had the opportunity to meet Dan Jordan in Nebraska at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I find it so interesting that he was born and raised in Ballantyne, Nebraska, in the Sandhills of Nebraska. And in my career, I get a lot of looks when people ask me, where are you from? And I say, Nebraska. And they're like, wow, you poor guy. That must be a terrible place to be from. But then I just remind myself, well, it was good enough for Dan Jordan, it was good enough for me. We had a very active college club, Baha'i College Club, at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I have no idea how it came to be, but Dan Jordan stopped in Lincoln and gave a talk to our college club. And that left a lasting impression on me in terms of what the possibilities are with regard to education. He talked about kinesthetic learning, he talked about nutrition, he talked about the arts and music, and he talked about the difference between content and process skills. At that time, I had no idea that I was going to become an educator. I was an English major. But as it turned out, he planted those seeds in my thinking about alternative approaches to formal education. Keith and I had the opportunity to work with Dan Jordan when we were pioneering in Honduras, and we were working at the Mayan school many years later, in the late 70s. And we had the good fortune of working in a private school, and the director there was very interested in Baha'i principles, and we shared with her a lot of printed information that we had gathered over the years on the ANISA model. And she encouraged us to share some of those things with the staff. And she even went so far as to pay, I find this hard to believe in retrospect, she paid for Dan Jordan to come to Honduras for several days to give in services to the faculty there. So if you can imagine, with just 20 or so teachers, to be able to interact with him over an extended period of time was really quite a bounty. And that too impacted, I'm sure, both of us in terms of our educational career. My experience indirectly in education started in the early 70s in Guatemala. I was ESL teacher in an international school there. And in my time in Guatemala, what I developed a deep appreciation for was the relationship between language and culture. Guatemala has 20-some indigenous groups. They have maintained their indigenous languages. Guatemala was a pioneer in bilingual education using native languages. And I was exposed to a lot of complexity. I'm sure Joan can back me up on this. The cultural diversity and the complexity there was overwhelming for a small town Nebraska guy like me. And so it's sort of like I discovered that there was a world out there. And it provoked in me an interest in anthropology. So after 2 years in Guatemala, returned to the University of Nebraska. English seemed rather boring compared to what else was going on in the world. So I majored in anthropology and minored in linguistics. And I developed a deep appreciation for the relationship between language, culture, and thinking. And I was fortunate to have a professor who supported my interest in Latin America and Guatemala. And in the process of learning to speak Spanish in Guatemala, and then later to spend most of my, not most, but a good part of my time in thinking and speaking in Spanish, I further developed my understanding about how much language impacts our thinking and how much our thinking impacts language as it relates to life in general, but specifically to education. So I'd like to give you one concrete example. There is some controversy among linguists and anthropologists about the degree to which thinking and language are connected. But in my experience, they're deeply connected, and it requires us to explore that concept, that possibility, if we want to be successful in teaching language minority students. So for example, if a student comes late to school and the student says, "El bus me dejó," that literally means the bus left me. A different student, a native speaker in English, would probably say, "I missed the bus." Same scenario, completely different perspective. The actor in El bus me dejó, the bus left me, is the bus, not me. It's not my fault that I missed the bus. It was early, it was late, who knows? But the actor, the responsible party, and I missed the bus is I, the student. So can you see how the administrator who has to, or the secretary or the principal who has to get that late student into class might reprimand the student somewhat differently based on that person's understanding of the student's perspective? That might seem like a fairly trivial example, but in fact, it is indicative of a different way of organizing and observing and acting in the world. After returning from Honduras and working in ESL and bilingual education for 6 years, I worked in a very small district in the outskirts of Phoenix. And I don't know how this happened, but a psychologist named Lee Hanel asked permission of our principal in this middle school to do a pilot program for the direct instruction of critical thinking and the enhancement of academic performance and intelligence. And the model he was using was called instrumental enrichment, which was developed by Dr. Reuven Feuerstein. The purpose of Feuerstein's work, by the way, he was a student of Piaget. He was working with students in the late 40s and early 50s in Israel who were orphans that experienced the Holocaust. So they had trauma, they had huge gaps in their education, nutritional deficiencies, any number of challenges that prevented them to be successful academically in formal education. So he developed a series of what he called instruments that addressed certain aspects of critical thinking that opened the doors for academic achievement. So Dr. Hanel, my principal, recommended me to Dr. Hanel to be a part of this project, this research project. And that's where I was first introduced to the direct instruction of critical thinking. And in fact, the project did produce measurable results. These were language minority students, Mexican-American first and second generation immigrants who themselves had a lot of challenges. And in a period of 3 months, we were able to demonstrate cognitive growth. Later in my career, I started to connect the dots about English as a second language, the skills that teachers need to be successful in supporting students. And so I developed what I called meaningful ESL when I returned to the Phoenix area. And I taught college courses to teachers on how to make English language instruction more productive for language minority students, using some of these principles from Feuerstein and some of my insights from the study of linguistics. My next stage, if you want to think of it that way, of development in this field was when I moved to Nicaragua, and I was the curriculum director and the elementary principal of a K-12 international bilingual school in Managua, Nicaragua. And even though the overall condition of life at that time was extremely difficult and even hazardous, because it was during the counter-revolutionary war period, the faculty there were very dedicated and very capable. And so I had the idea to take it to another level with the direct instruction of process skills. And so I invited teachers to stay after school. It's hard, in retrospect, it's hard to believe that this actually happened. But I got maybe a third of the faculty to volunteer to stay after school for several weeks to help me develop this thinking skills curriculum. And we were able to develop 22 discrete critical thinking or process skills. And we were able to define them. We developed a schematic version of each one, a student-friendly definition that was what we would consider an operational definition, and a schematic, with the idea that these could be used in the classroom. So the structure was really very simple. Each one had a name, it had a schematic, and a simple definition. Can you see that?
What's the title of the book?
The title of the book is The Learning Ladder, which I published in Arizona in the early 2000s. So,
is it in print?
Unfortunately, no. I checked on Amazon and I checked with a private bookseller. One listed as out of stock, another one listed it as out of print.
Yeah, I would really encourage you to go to a self-publishing company so that it can be available print on demand. Because if you do, I'm buying 5 copies right now.
Well, I can certainly send you one for the project. I don't have very many copies left, but I'd be certainly happy to send you one for the project. So I was very fortunate when I returned, excuse me, from Nicaragua with the nuts and bolts of this. Oh, by the way, you might be interested to know, since this is not something that we were trained in, you might be interested to know what those 22 discrete thinking skills are. We don't have time to go into detail with any of them, but I think it might be good for you to at least hear them and kind of ask yourself, am I aware? Could I name 22 thinking skills? And I think most teachers would not be able to, which is really the heart of the problem that we face. So not in any particular order, actually the order is a level of complexity, but it starts with association, classification, seriation, extrapolation, causality, conservation, negation, equivalence, identity, correlation, analysis, conjunction, disjunction, interpolation, implication, deductive inference, closure, reversibility, analogy, inductive inference, synthesis, and mediation. There are undoubtedly more, but in our project in Nicaragua, that's what we came up with. I was very fortunate when I returned, well, actually, after I got back from Nicaragua and had this much of the work documented, I took a pause from education. I was at the Baha'i International Community Office at New York headquarters for the United Nations and had another exposure to education on a global scale and other opportunities to see the relationship between culture, language, and literacy. So it kind of went dormant for quite a while. When I came back from the Baha'i office at the United Nations, I returned to the Phoenix area and worked as a bilingual and ESL program director, and eventually got my doctorate in educational administration. But it wasn't until after I got out of the central office position and worked as a consultant and teacher trainer that I was fortunate enough to find a company and the president of a company who believed in what I was doing. And so when I was working for the company called the Learning Ladder, the president of that company encouraged me to actually put this in the form of a book, the work that we had done on processing critical thinking skills. And I was also very fortunate to have a very good editor who was very hard on me, I thought at the time. He said, I remember very clearly, he said, stop talking about this and tell people how to do it. So it was an attempt to take a set of very complex ideas, very challenging pedagogical methods, and to put them in the form of a book that teachers could use more or less independently. This was after that period in the mid to late 90s when the pressure across the country was to develop standards. Each state was in the process of developing standards for educational achievement, which eventually led to the No Child Left Behind legislation in 2000. So I was a member of the committee in Arizona to write the English language teaching skills. And I tried my best to encourage that committee to incorporate considerations for language minority students, which was somewhat successful. But it was clear to me that the other people on the committee and the teachers that I was working with had very little idea of what was really involved in helping students who were struggling between languages and cultures. And so as I said, I was very fortunate to be a part of this consulting company. And the company actually published the book and hired an editor that helped me get it to fruition. And in addition to the process skills part of it, I also did an alignment where I could create a connection between each of the standards that the state of Arizona adopted and the thinking skills that were embedded in each one of those standards. So that's what we used to call a crosswalk, the curriculum crosswalk, so that I was able to demonstrate very clearly the relationship between the outcome or the standard, the objective that was being put before teachers. This is what you're supposed to do. What was less obvious was what were the thinking skills embedded in the standard that were necessary for students to be successful. So part of that crosswalk was my way of validating this approach to discrete thinking skills, process skills, and learning outcomes. While I was finishing the book, I was still working as assistant superintendent for curriculum, and I offered training in the district. It was a district of 13 different schools, K-12. And one of the more open-minded principals who attended some of my workshops and conferences and also local training, she decided that this was really valuable, and she decided to pilot a program in her school where she would have a thinking skill of the week, a process skill of the week. And so she went on the closed circuit TV on Monday and introduced it with that simple graphic that I showed you and encouraged her teachers during that week to try it. So one of the most confirming things that I can remember is I walked into a classroom on Tuesday after she had introduced the skill, which was classification. And she walked over to a kindergartner who was very busy sorting buttons. Buttons are a great way to teach classification. And the kindergartner looked up at the principal and she said, "Can you tell me what rule I'm using to sort my buttons?" So she had internalized the concept of classification, the fact that you have to have a rule or a method to guide you in how to classify. But the fact that she put it in the form of a question to the principal was just amazing to me. And it was an indication of one of the struggles I've had over the years. And it relates to the Baha'i Principle about the different generations in this age. And I consistently found that teachers underestimated the ability of their students. And this was particularly true in ESL and bilingual classrooms. The conflating of lack of English skills with lack of intelligence. That sounds like it should have been counterintuitive, but in fact, it's very prevalent. So this kindergartner was ample proof to me that they can do so much more than we think they can, particularly if we focus on process skills. One of the things that you probably remember in the Anissa literature was the importance of transference. And the reason that I thought process skills were so powerful is because they are by their very nature transferable. They are not content specific. They're not subject specific. If you think about the standards that we deal with in education now and the emphasis on content, very little of what we teach students in the area of content is transferable. And that's one of the reasons we get so many questions from students. Why do I have to take algebra? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to do that? Because they do not see intuitively that what they're learning is transferable. And that was what I tried to demonstrate in the book and in my teacher training efforts, that these process skills are powerful because they're transferable. The other thing that I emphasized was that for language minority students who come from rich backgrounds, literate backgrounds, literate families, the need for direct instruction and process skills is much less because they are more likely to be exposed to adult conversations and to thinking patterns that are embedded in the language but are made explicit by interacting with adults. But in poverty situations and language minority situations, it's not uncommon for children to be raised by other children or to be raised by the television or by video games. And so it's not likely that a student is intuitively going to develop patterns of thinking in that kind of an environment. And when I talked about language minority students in the United States, that was the population that I was dealing with. So they had all kinds of deficits, much as Feuerstein's experience in Israel, that were not being addressed by teachers in the regular classroom. Another example that comes to mind about the importance of going below the surface in terms of vocabulary and content. I developed a very effective program at a high school in Arizona where we had teaching assistants who went with students into the classroom. Teachers were not necessarily trained with ESL strategies, so these assistants would go into the classroom with these Spanish dominant students, hear the lecture, translate for them during the class, and then after the class, meet with them separately to fill in the gaps and to make sure that they understood what they were being asked to do. It both developed language skills, but it also developed academic skills. In one scenario that I found very fascinating, there was a sophomore in high school who was a very diligent student. Her English was adequate to function in the classroom. But when they were talking about erosion, for some reason, she just couldn't quite understand what the lecture was about, what the activities in the book were about, or what the assignment was about. And the teaching assistant working with her was a little bit baffled about why is this so hard for her? Why can't she get her head around what this concept of erosion is and what she's supposed to do in her assignment? And intuitively, the teaching assistant, who was very, very, very capable, figured out that what the student did not understand was the force of gravity. So concepts are embedded in concepts. Words are embedded in words. So when she took the time to explain the dynamics of the force of gravity, all of a sudden the lights went on and the student was able to understand what the dynamic of erosion was about. So from there you could go to teaching. It's a teaching opportunity to go from there to teaching the process skill of causality. So it's effective teachers see gaps, fill those gaps, and if they can attach a process skill that's transferable to other learning situations, it accelerates student achievement. And that was the focus of the book and the focus of the teacher training that I did, to escalating student achievement through the teaching of both content and process skills. I had the opportunity to do this teacher training in different contexts. And one example that really stands out to me, I was asked to do a one-day in-service in a K-12 district in West Texas. It was really a challenge because it was a K-12 district. It was an auditorium with about 200 people. And so I was taking them through this idea of linking process skills with content skills. And they actually developed lesson plans and shared them with the total group. And so it was challenging, but it seemed to work because they generated on their own some very good examples of linking content and process skills. When it was all over, the high school principal came over to me, and I felt very threatened. He was agitated. His eyes were big. He got up close to me like he was going to assault me. That was his body language. And he said, "I have a question for you. Why, after 30 years in education, am I hearing about this for the first time?" He could see the need for it. He could see the power of it, but he thought it was tragic that he was hearing about it this late in his educational career. The reality for me in trying to do teacher training with the book and with teachers, whether it's a school level or a district level, the realization that I came to was that for a variety of reasons in our country, in our system, talking about the United States, not everywhere, but certainly here, we have not over the years been able to attract the best and the brightest when it comes to recruiting teachers. And so what I found over and over again was the fact that teachers found this interesting, but not manageable. That kindergartner proved to me that students were quite capable of understanding and using process skills. But the majority of the teachers that I worked with were not comfortable with it. It was too challenging, too abstract, too demanding for them to actually try to utilize it. In light of that, I scaled back to some degree in my work as a teacher, trainer, and consultant. And in a K-12 district, a friend of mine was the superintendent, and he had me come in and do an in-service for his K-12 staff. And instead of focusing on the process skills the way I did in the book, I thought, well, maybe as an intermediate step, it'd make more sense to talk about Bloom's taxonomy. And so I had seen in the context of low expectations and virtually total neglect of content and critical thinking skills, I had seen how unlikely it was in my teacher observations and my teacher training follow-up for teachers to teach at the higher levels of Bloom's. And analysis, synthesis, and evaluation just didn't show up very often in the lessons that I observed. So as a kind of an experiment for myself, I gave this K-12 staff a fairly long list of questions. After reviewing Bloom's taxonomy, I didn't assume that they knew what it was. I reviewed it. And then I asked them to identify the questions on this list at different levels to see if they could identify, because it's not realistic to expect people to generate their own examples if they can't first identify those different levels of thinking. And to my great disappointment, they were not able to do that. I had to stop my plan. I had to shift gears and go in a different direction because teachers were getting too frustrated when I asked them to identify questions at the different levels of Bloom's. So if they weren't able to do that, I had to admit the fact that it was unlikely that they were going to be able to do the things that I was actually hoping that they could do, which was the alignment of process skills with content skills. And so I have to say that even though this was my focus, this was my passion over the years, I personally was unsuccessful at getting the model to work. And I think in surveying what's happening in the world right now, I think as a profession, we have failed at teaching in that way. So I hate to be doom and gloom about it. Maybe the time will come, like Peter was saying before, that someday people will pay attention to this. But it is very clear to me that when you look at the insanity that we see in the media, whether it's politics or economics or whatever it might be, critical thinking is not prevalent, in my opinion. So I'll be happy to entertain questions or comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and by the way, the reason why you don't see my face is because my computer has decided that it's not going to show the camera. The camera is not going to work today. I don't know why, but it's not because I'm trying to hide behind a stock photograph, but I thought you'd be amused to know this. This is a picture of me shortly after my wedding in Madagascar, in Antananarivo, which is the capital of Madagascar. And it's a picture of me on the street with my wedding. I wore this dark sort of maroon shirt with a colored tie and then a sort of beige suit and my fedora hat. And so it's kind of more entertaining than my face, actually. So I just thought I'd mention that. But, I was thinking that both Juanita and Karen have links to schools, to people who are actually teaching today. I mean, live on. And so it may be that they would be in a position to share these critical thinking skills, the information that you've collected. And that's why I was thinking I wanted multiple copies of the book so I could send them each a copy. And I know other people, because you're so right that this is neglected, but it's neglected because people never thought of doing it. Or if they thought of doing it, they never compiled a list that tried to be comprehensive. So you've already done a lot of work. And we should be building on what you've already done rather than having to reinvent the wheel. And so, again, I really hope that you can make a copy of your book available. And then, I can arrange to have it scanned so that I can send a digital copy to whoever wants one. Because I want to study it. I'm really excited about this because, we've talked about process skills and for decades, or probably well over 100 years now. I mean, Pestalozzi talked about this, had the hand, the head, and the heart back in the 1700s, that, all of those involve skills, and so what are the skills, and defining them and then figuring out how to develop them. But that didn't translate into the classroom in most cases. And so there's no reason why we can't do it on our own scale. I have 2 children. I can do it with my children. I'm homeschooling them,
Really?
and I think I think I just want to find out how to begin. So I'm going to stop talking, and because Juanita and Karen have a whole lot more to say than I do on this topic.
Well, I'm not sure how much connection I have now. From about 1992 to 2007, we were working a lot with teachers at Nur University. But that program is no longer in existence, partially because all sorts of small universities in Bolivia started giving very, very, very economical programs and giving them minimum so that the teachers could get their title as, on the bachelor's level. And it got to the point that, well, Nur could never compete. Nur always gave courses to teachers, at charging less than they charged for other careers that they were giving. I mean, I have contacts with lots of teachers. What I think I could help with, especially if Peter scanned it, is, what I have a lot of experience with is self-publishing. I've published probably self-published to almost 20 books between Spanish and English on Amazon. So, if you send me the contents, I could probably put together and so that it could be self-published on Amazon, so that it would not only be limited to people that Peter knows, but, it would be published in your name, and then, you guys could help promote it. I think I could collaborate with that if you would like. So that's just one thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
That would be wonderful.
So I need a scanned copy, and maybe if it can be even more than the scanned copy, because I see you have a diagram on each page, so a fairly high quality, I guess it'd be a picture of each diagram, maybe a little higher quality than in the general scanned copy. But anyway, that's something that possibly I could collaborate with. Hope I'm not biting off more than I can chew.
Well, we very carefully developed those student-friendly versions. It's like, if you can envision, like that one principal did the thinking skill of the week in a classroom situation or in a homeschooling situation, each of those has its own page. And so they can be presented to a student one at a time and then put up on a bulletin board for reference. And students can identify them and be reminded of them as they go through the academic year.
Mm-hmm.
So not to drop that, if I could just say this briefly, is Dan, I'm going to give you my address. I'm going to send it to you by email. If you will send 2 copies, and I'll tell you why. Because one copy I'm going to take apart so I can properly scan it, and there won't be any twisted pages or parts that are not in focus or so forth. I'll literally take the binding off, and I'll scan it high resolution, and then I'll send it to Joan. Okay. And so the other thing is, the other copy I'm giving to Stanford University, so they have it in their library, so that and they'll get the scanned version as well, so they can put it up on their their library website.
Okay.
So Karen, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It was very interesting for me, and I'm really I'm very interested to see the book, because just from hearing it, sometimes, well, I think I did not grasp the whole concept, but some details seemed quite familiar to me, as for the time being I'm a mathematics teacher educator, and the importance of process skills is something that in mathematics education is quite it's an idea that in Germany in the last, let's say, 20 years became very popular, and it's the main focus in a way for mathematics teacher training or education. And and then your conclusion was a bit skeptical, so to say, that and of course each person has his or her own experiences. But from my experience, I think that I see both. On the one hand side, I also see that there is a big lack of critical thinking in also in teachers or my students. That means prospective teachers. And sometimes I think, well, there is a lot to develop, yes. And on the other hand side, maybe, well, there are also quite promising developments. So, well, I think we should not lose hope. And of course, it's good to have a book or to have to share material and to share concepts and also what I think in order to teach process skills, you need some content as an example, and I think probably you already found content that is suitable for teaching process skills, and that would be interesting. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not an either or situation, it's an and. It's an integrated approach. And some teachers were put off by it that I don't have time to teach process skills. I don't have time to teach all the content skills that I'm supposed to be teaching. And so it's the integration of the two that creates the power and that makes it manageable. So I challenge myself in this crosswalk process with all the standards to see, are these process skills truly universal? Are they transferable? So let me just give you one example. I'm looking at my own crosswalk here in mathematics. And so this is Arizona standards. It may not resonate for you in other countries, but the objective is to determine the number that comes next in a series of numbers. And the next step in the contest is predict the next number or set of numbers in a series. So the process skill is that extrapolation. You extrapolate from the pattern, and then you have closure in your own thinking that it must be this or it must be that. In another context, determine the pattern that governs a series of numbers, not just the next one, but the pattern, interpolation, inductive inference, and implication. So you don't have to do the process skill to teach those two mathematics skills. But when you do that, you're teaching much more than just a one mathematics objective. My vision is that you enhance the deep meaning of that mathematical process for the students in the context of math, but you also expand their capacity to think critically and logically in any context. So that idea of accelerating learning is not just a nice idea, it's not just a nice objective, but it can be made practical if you can integrate teaching the two types of skills. The other thing that you reminded me of in your second comment about being a little bit cynical or pessimistic is that when I was teaching graduate students recently, not too recently, it's been a while already, but teaching graduate students, and just for fun, I thought I would ask them, what is liberal arts education? And they looked at me and they said, well, is that just kind of liberal democratic education? They truly had no idea what the concept of liberal arts education is or was. And so we talked about it. The emphasis now, not across the board, but in many university systems over the last 10 years in the United States, we've shifted from a liberal arts focus to a career or a job focus. So because of the political and economic pressures, universities, and this may be true of your experience, Joan, in Bolivia as well, the emphasis is on getting good jobs, good paying jobs, and making sure that there's an explicit connection between higher education and successful job and career development, which of course is important. But I think that historically, students coming out of a liberal arts education where they're exposed to many different things at a fairly deep level, the probability that they were developing thinking skills inherently or unconsciously was pretty high. But the more we move to this career and job focus, the less likely students are to generate on their own critical thinking abilities. So the need is more now than it was when we were in college.
Karen, what ages are you teaching math to?
Well, my students are prospective teachers in primary schools that in Germany that or in our area that is age 6 to 13.
Thank you.
And Karen, how old are your these people who are training for careers as teachers? Do they all fall into the same generation, or do you have older people as well as people in their 20s?
Well, we even sometimes have 18-year-olds that have just come from school, and we also have quite a lot of persons who had some profession and then changed or want to become teachers, and so they are any age from 30, 40, nearly 50, so different ages, but most of them are quite young.
Do you have a particular program or approach that you use?
Well, our orientation is the German standards for mathematics education. There are some standards for all the states of Germany, and well, and also the curricula of well, I'm now near in Brandenburg. That's a state near Berlin, and we use the curriculum that is, well, the teachers are going should be prepared to
Sure.
teach.
Yeah.
Just to elaborate a little bit further on the situation in the United States, which is not universal by any means, but for a variety of reasons over the last 20 or 30 years, the people that have been attracted to the educational profession in this country and in most teachers' colleges are in the lower half of their peers academically, in terms of qualifying scores to enter university and in terms of their high school performance. Whereas in a country like Finland, which far outperforms the United States in academic achievement, it's very difficult to become a teacher. And because of the status and the pay structure in Finland, they tend to attract what I would consider much more qualified, much more academically capable teachers than we do in this country. And those are very difficult patterns to change, but it helps explain a little bit further why I was a little, in fact, very pessimistic about the capabilities, the capacities of the teachers that I worked with. In addition to that, the pattern is also very clear that the language minority students and the poverty students in this country are much more likely to be served by undercapable teachers. The high-income districts attract a different caliber of teachers consistently. And so the inequities embedded in our system in the United States make it very unlikely that students who need the support the most are going to get it.
Well, I know that problem. It's a bit similar in Germany.
Is it really?
Yeah, I think the situation would concerns the well, income of well, and the state of the societal status of teachers. There maybe the situation is a bit between Finland and what you just told us about the United States, but that students from lower well, societal status, that they that they that these differences are preserved by school and are also preserved by the teachers they are taught and so on. That is quite similar. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a self-perpetuating system.
Yeah.
I just wanted to interject one thing because you brought up Finland. And from for something that I encountered online fairly recently was that according to reports from people living in various countries, most of the countries of the world now, Finland was listed as the one in which people are the happiest with the way of life they have. And not just for 1 year, for a series of years now, it's been listed as number one. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? And the country that has the highest educational, status and that is paying teachers the best. How about that? Isn't that interesting correlation?
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about. I've got 2 pages of notes, Dan. You have to. Dan and I go way back together. He didn't mention he was the secretary of the National Spiritual Assembly of Honduras also for several years, and has done a lot with developing just Baha'i direct teaching programs. And then we somehow we keep reconnecting, Dan. It's I haven't been able to keep you out of my life, I guess, but somehow,
even if you tried.
I know it just keeps coming back. And so we were together in the Townsend School outside of Prague for a whole week with Dr. Donald Streets, who was the assistant of Dan Jordan, and we were about 20 educators and specialists and doctors, and then we had probably another 20 online. They were reading the reports every day. It was before Zoom, but we had email, I guess, and so we were working on what was called it came out to be the International Institute for Human Development. And Dan was on the steering committee for that, I believe. I was off in Colombia, but that was the follow-up. And I think it was very interesting. At the time, we had one of the participants was in touch with, was it Romania, I believe it was, or Bulgaria? I forget her name. She's a popular Baha'i speaker on podcasts now, but the Iron Curtain had fallen apart, and she had contacts in the government that said, we inherited this curriculum from the Soviet Union, and we don't like it, and we're lost. It's been 60 years without developing our own national curriculum. Would you help us? And so that was one of the projects we were looking at. Unfortunately, the Institute didn't carry on, but this whole thing about the differences between countries and the different needs, and trying to find approaches to mathematics, to education that can transfer across boundaries, I think is, that was another thing that Dan was involved in. I don't know if you want to talk about that with the steering committee, what you guys were thinking, Dan?
Well, there was hope of, to think about resurrecting Anissa is not realistic. I mean, that's not the way the world works, but the focus was on trying to continue the conversation about education reform, educational innovation, and new models. And the struggle has always been that there's a clear signal that it's too soon to try to develop a quote unquote Baha'i model of education, that we're too far away from that in terms of evolution, cultural and social evolution, but some intermediate step to try to keep the focus on how we could do a better job with education. because it has everything to do with what I think of as Dan's primary focus and his colleagues throughout was the development of human potential. And this to me is an aspect of developing human potential, which is fundamental, it's critical. And I think the attempt with that institute was to try to keep some amount of forward motion in the dialogue and in the development of something that could eventually become a model.
Yeah, it's interesting. Why can't I think of the lady's name? Her book was Critical Consciousness. I think interesting. You were talking about critical thinking, and she was focused on critical consciousness. Who am I talking about? What's her name? Oh, she's quite prolific now. I could send
It'll
it
come
later.
to you. Yep.
Yeah, it'll come. But anyway, that was another idea I had, Peter, if you're still there.
I'm here.
Is that, you know, we have different participants and people that have shown interest in speakers. I could be interesting if both participants and speakers could write just a 1-paragraph bio, and if they're willing to be contacted, just what they're doing or their interests, so that we could develop a network of support with these different ideas, and especially if we can reach out to the younger generation, you know, like Karen and Joan are doing, to influence upcoming psychologists and educators and Baha'is or not, you know. I think that's one of the great things about these Zoom conferences that Peter's been organizing, is just all the connections. Oh my gosh. That's amazing.
Yeah. So,
I mean, you asked for a headshot, right? Remember, you asked for a headshot.
yes,
Peter,
yes.
so I was thinking, well, if we did headshots, we could also do like a 1 pair, like my research interests are X, Y, and Z, and I can be contacted at this, you know. Or,
yeah, well, it's I'm going to continue to pursue that. With some people, a simple email request for a headshot resulted in one within an hour, and with other people, I've been waiting for days. So
yeah. Yeah.
okay, and there may well be somebody out there that I have to actually visit in order for them to give me a headshot. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
so you know, and that's, I think, one of the things that you point out is encouragement. There are many people who have been involved in education as a career at some point in their lives that grew so discouraged by their experience or by their interactions with other Baha'is or with other educators that they lost hope, and so they went on to something else. And I'm trying very hard to get those people in particular to come out of the woods and share their experience, and to encourage them, because every single one of us has had experiences that someone else has never had, and we learn so much this way, and we discover resources that can benefit our own work. Like, did I know about Dan's book? No, never heard of it before. No, and before I got to know Wade Franson, I had no idea of Joan's work. Zero. You know, before I asked around about isn't there somebody in Europe who's interested in Baha'i education? I never heard of Karen. So, you know, this is an organic process, and I don't mean that. I mean that in the real sense of, we learn by reaching out and making connections with people, and this is not going to go away. As long as I'm alive, it's going to be my passion to bring Baha'i educators together.
Yeah.
And eventually, I hope other like-minded educators who aren't Baha'is, because we're not a closed club, you know, we're an open club, you know, and we want, like, for example, I was fascinated that Dan referenced Piaget, because when I went to ed school, you know, when I got my teacher training, people were very excited about Piaget back in the, you know, this was back in the 70s when I was at UMass Amherst, and Dan Jordan was one of my teachers. And so people were very, very excited about Piaget at that point, but I never heard anything about Piaget and successors to his work ever since then. It's been this, it's almost like Piaget was an anomaly, and then nobody picked up his work after him. And
Right.
maybe I'm going to discover that he wasn't an anomaly, because you know people who have taken his work and applied it or tried it out in other cultural contexts and found that the same stages of child development occur in Botswana and in Siberia and in Japan that he discovered in Europe, because that was one of the limitations of his work, was that he was working with a small, you know, data set in a
Right.
particular place and time.
And he
what
was
we
a pioneer.
find, what?
He was a pioneer. He had a different focus.
Exactly. And so that's one of the challenges, is how much of this is culturally determined and how much of it is actually endemic to human, you know, consciousness. Like,
Well,
are there really, like, because like, for example, you know, Piaget wasn't the only one who had this idea of stages. Of course, Montessori had the same idea. Rudolf Steiner had the same idea. But to what degree do we know that those stages of growth and the capacities that are developed at those different stages, how much do we know about that cross-culturally? You know?
I'm glad you brought that up, because with my first degree was in anthropology and linguistics, as I mentioned, and so this was always in the back of my mind when I was developing this method, and it would be very interesting to study that and research that cross culturally. Anthropologists have always been fascinated from the very beginning of the field in cultural universals. There are very few, but there are some, religion being one of them. But what I find interesting is that even though one of the Baha'i principles is universal language, that the day will come when we will have a universal language, in the meantime, whether it's by intention or by default, English has become the universal language. And throughout the world, there's an interest in learning English and getting a US type education. So even though I could not make the case at this point that these process skills are universally embedded in languages across the globe, I can confidently say that students in every part of the globe need these skills to be successful in acquiring English and acquiring professions that utilize English, and being successful in the kind of default global system of education, which has become English.
What might be interesting, well, I'll be talking at the end of the series about my work, but after I said goodbye to Dan for a while from Honduras, when we were delving into the NISA model more, then I migrated to Colombia and eventually did my doctoral research, which was cross-cultural. So I was looking at Piagetian sequences and finding the same sequence in those kids, and finding a wide range of abilities. And the delightful thing, one of the delightful things I found was one of the most advanced children in terms of logical thinking was in the poorest neighborhood of the city, Barranquilla, about 4 million people. Absolutely brilliant child. And she was getting by on one meal a day. And it just showed me that this human potential of both teachers and parents and kids knows no strict social economic boundaries. We're going to find brilliance all over the place. And fortunately, like in Colombia, I found brilliant teachers that they were poor. They didn't have super educations, but they were like hungry. And they would just say, you think you're abstract, but give it to us. Come on, come on, come on. We want to learn. But we don't care how abstract that is. Don't treat us like that we're some low-class, unintelligent person, you know. And sure, it was a challenging for him, but it was like, and of course, there were a lot of teachers, especially in public schools, didn't even show up to work, you know, in some of the public schools. But there were, you know, it was something that gave me hope. But one of the things too, I think for Karen is that I've worked with American schools and those that are more European oriented with Anglo schools and teachers from other German or Hebrew schools, things like that. And what I found was that the Europeans are more open to these process critical thinking skills that Dan talks about because of that European influence of these brilliant thinkers down through the years. I can't remember all their names, but Rousseau and Montessori and others, you know, and Piaget and on and on. And I've worked with Canadian teachers in schools, and the Canadians are more influenced through the British system. So they're more European in their outlook of the way they see children. And the US people are more mechanical and more, what do you call it, like factory oriented with the standards. And first you do this and this and this and this, and everybody's got to do the same thing at the same time with the same expectation. And if you don't do that, you're going to get a bad grade, you know. Whereas the Europeans were more open. And so one of the things that I've seen over the years was the development of the International Baccalaureate system, which is European in its origin. I don't know if Karen, if you're familiar with the IB program and its history.
Sorry, could you please repeat the name of the program? I didn't get it.
International Baccalaureate.
Okay,
And
yeah.
I don't know if it started in Germany or which country, but it was just a high school program, and it was very conservative. And Dr. Jordan used to criticize it quite a bit because it was content oriented and aimed at getting better scores and things. But then it developed over the years, and whoever developed it got into this research of how children learn. And so it gradually worked its way down, was like, how do we prepare kids to be better at high school in the International Baccalaureate? It's still called IB. And the reasoning was, well, we have to get to middle school students, and then we have to get to primary schools, and we have to get to early childhood. So they cranked it all the way. Now they're just opening up an early childhood program just now. They already have a primary years program in place, PYP. And then there's a middle years program, MYP, and then comes the International Baccalaureate. And their philosophy has evolved so that they respect the learners more. What you were saying, Dan, about underestimating. They're discovering that children are natural inquirers, and they need to have ownership of their own learning. And then there's this other model. I don't know if Karen's familiar with it. It comes out of a town in Italy called Reggio, Emilia, which was born out of the disaster of World War II. And there's a community that decided as a community that their most cherished possession was their children. So the community became a school, and the kids learned from the baker and the laundromat and all the businesses, and together they raise these kids. But the kids make a lot of their own decisions about learning. And so that has now become a cutting edge program, popular all over the world. But it has roots in Montessori and Piaget and these others, you know. So when I'm a consultant to like a British type school, they listen more to my research that I've done with Piaget. But I'll probably be talking about that later, and I'll have books for Peter's children, and I'll have books for Karen to look at, which are actually copies were given to the Piaget Society office, wherever that is, maybe in Geneva, Switzerland. Somewhere they have a center for Piagetian things. But that was another road that I walked down that Dan knows something about, that I found some research being done out in Iowa, of all places, right next to Nebraska, a cutting edge program in Iowa, out in the corn and the pigs and everything, you know. but that's another journey that I'll be talking about later, and posting a bunch of information. So, and then there's all these connections, and Dan, we'll have to talk later, but I don't know if this makes sense to everybody, but I also got to know, I don't know how to pronounce it right, but Ruben Feuerstein.
Feuerstein.
Feuerstein, okay. All I know is Firestone Tires, which is the English translation of his last name, another Jewish family that started a good business. But so I corresponded with him, and when I was in Jerusalem, he invited me over to his center to watch and work with kids. But he was at some thinking conference in New York, so I got to meet his son instead. But I spent a whole day in the Feuerstein Center working with what in the old days we would call mentally retarded or cognitively challenged now. Children that were coming there from all over the world. And Venezuela was also using his work. I don't know if you knew that, Dan.
No, I didn't.
They had a Ministerio de Inteligencia.
It's a good idea.
Yeah. And they tried to do his work. I don't think it lasted that long, but it was he is well known mostly in learning centers in every country in Latin America except Argentina. I don't know what happened there. Maybe something with the Nazi refugees, because he's Jewish. I don't know why he's so rejected in Argentina, but everywhere else has this enrichment. What's it called?
Instrumental enrichment.
Instrumental. Yeah, they use instrumental enrichment. It's huge. And then I was looking at another Piagetian program that was different. And it is not direct teaching. It's more, and I wouldn't call it discovery. It's more like children developing their own abilities cognitively, and then later giving a name to it. But I was never satisfied with all the work, because one of the things we learned in the NISA model was eventually children they learn how to learn, called learning competence. But the higher stages is that you become conscious of your learning process. You're just not a good learner with a teacher, but when you become conscious, you take charge of your own learning, which is the highest thing, because it's really lifetime learning. And then we hear of lifelong learners. And so in my work, what I try to do with teachers is say that's not enough either. It's not lifelong learning. It's becoming a lifetime teacher of yourself, because you are the teacher. You're not just the learner. You're the teacher and the learner all at once. And then you know how you learn and what resources you need. And so I was asking these researchers in Iowa, because they had this beautiful chart of the developmental sequence, which has a research base in many countries around the world, 50, 60 countries. And the sequence never changes, whether it's Africa or Asia. In my case, it was Colombia. The sequence is the same. We know the sequence, but it's not tied to any age. It's not tied to any grade level. You just have to diagnose and then move forward, But I kept asking them, I would say, well, at what point in this process do I hand the chart over to the child and say, here's the developmental sequence, you take charge.
Well, if
And
I
you
could,
find out works and tell me how I can help you.
Right.
Right?
well, if I could interrupt you there, Keith.
Well, it's your talk. You're supposed to talk, Dan. I'm trying to just go ahead.
Again, with my anthropological and linguistic background,
Yeah.
and we know from science as well how important it is to name things. Naming is the first step in creating what some educational psychologists have referred to as a schema or a concept behind a name. And when students know how to name what they're doing, then they take control. And that's the power of having the teachers and the students share this. It's more than just a vocabulary. It's a set of procedures. It's a set of steps. It's a set of strategies. And so when students and teachers can be conversant about this, then students literally take over. And that to me is what's been missing, is that the only place that I'm aware of, you can correct me if I've missed something, but I think the only students historically in the United States that have exposed anything similar to this are students who were involved in debate clubs and logic, direct instruction of logic, the classics. And so those students did in fact learn a vocabulary and learn a set of strategies to support the debate process. But that was the rare exception. It wasn't typical of what most students would experience. So that idea of naming and defining and practicing and developing a rich schema behind each one of these process skills is why I tend to use the term direct instruction. We don't just leave it to chance. Even though some students acquire it, some students have enrichment outside the classroom. So some students do, in fact, more or less on their own, without giving credit to the teacher sometimes, develop a high level of critical thinking capacity. But for most, it's left to chance.
Yeah. How does that sit with you, Karen?
Well, I think right now I don't have an example that could I could add here.
Let me give you an example of how I don't know if we differ. I think it's just a sequence, Dan, but what my training was, and I'm talking about 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds up to even high school, middle school. So I not now, but I used to train math teachers, Karen, from teaching, first of all, logical math, and then into arithmetic and numbers and the digit system. So I'm not sure where our two oceans would meet, Dan, but it would be like let me give you an example with the buttons. You talked about the buttons. So for younger kids especially, what we start with in our training is not the words. We start with acting on concrete objects, okay? And then watching what the kids do, and then asking questions to move them beyond that. And then at some point, they should have the vocabulary, but I'm not sure clear where that is. So in our classroom, I would literally have a box of buttons, okay? And this was one of maybe well, I had a science center also. I also taught sciencing process skills. So we had about 80 different hands-on materials that they could choose from and use for as long as they wanted. And so with a box of buttons, we'd say, the introduction would be, hey, look, we got a box of things here. They're called buttons. Let's see what you can do with this. Goodbye. That was it. to buy. And then it was all the way through. Here's a box of blocks. Maybe they were Cuisenaire rods. Maybe they were just shapes. Maybe it was just shells that we collected out on the beach in Barranquilla. Just all kinds of stuff that you could build with or whatever. But the broadest question was, here's a box of stuff. Let's see what you can do with it, you know. And we tried to have things that were interesting, full of color, different shapes, natural objects, manufactured objects, and we would watch what they're interested in. And if they weren't interested in material, we would remove it. So it was supply and demand, you know. We had to find things. And then we knew that there were relationships in there. We knew there were rules. And I would always be amazed at the rules that the kids would come up with. And I had one set, there was a set of keys. And this kid was making 2 piles or 3 piles. And I couldn't figure out his rule. But he had a rule. And then I finally had asked, and I didn't say, what were your rule? It was like, tell me about this pile. What would you name the pile? And I wouldn't name it. That was part of our teaching strategy, was the child had to talk about his own work. And son of a gun, this guy was looking at, you know how each key has a hole where you put your key ring? He found 3 different types of holes. One were round, one was oval, one was like hexagonal or something. I'd had that for a whole year in the classroom. I never noticed, you know, that the holes were different, you know. Usually they go by the color or the kind or the shape or whatever, you know. But I go, oh my God, isn't that something, you know? And so that's how, then we would open it up and say, oh, you made these 3 groups and they have names. And I go, can you make fewer groups? Can you collapse your groups? And that was a challenge. Then we would say, can you make more groups? Can you break your subgroups into more subgroups? And we had materials that you could do that with. And that's how they developed different types of classification, let's see. But then at some point, they need to learn, you know, this is called class inclusion, and this is called seriation or ordering, whatever you want to call it. And then transfer. Okay, now can you classify ideas, something really abstract? Can you take a list of something? You know, it doesn't, but we would always start with the little ones, with concrete things, coconuts and seeds.
Well,
maybe you can talk about that. Yeah.
Your example raises a fundamental challenge or issue as it relates to educational innovation and alternative teaching methods, and that's the idea of efficiency. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the reasons that some very well-grounded, well-researched, what I would consider enlightened approaches have failed because of the lack of efficiency. When you take it to scale, when you take consider how many students in a classroom, how much time for that activity, what else has to be taught in the day, that's where my bias goes toward direct instruction, because you can achieve some of the same outcomes in a more efficient way. And so in that scenario, I would present that graphic to students about what does it mean to classify, and preschoolers can learn those words. That's another area where we tend to underestimate their ability. They're all about learning words. They learn, you know, sometimes, you know, dozens of words in a day in a rich environment. So they get a name for it. They get a graphic. We talk about in the definition, which I didn't give you much time to look at. It talks about, you know, sorting things in with by a rule or a characteristic. And so you don't dictate the rules and the characteristics, but you create the concept. And at that point, you turn them loose and then watch them classify, and then get them to verbalize the rule. And then you get students to move around the room and look at each other's results and see if the kids can figure out what the rule was without the active students. So there's an element of discovery, but I think that's one of the areas where we, and I don't know if it's true of Anissa or not, but I know in some other cases, the lack of efficiency has really undermined the ability, the sustainability of some of innovative approaches.
Well, but it depends on how you measure efficiency. And I think there I really see that in in the latest research, there is some, people are starting to think about these things from a different perspective. So if you take tests right after teaching something that children afterwards should just give back in a test, then maybe you may have some efficiency in this short-term teaching. Well, but this example that Keith described, this is the effects are on a longer term, and I think in a way maybe it's more efficient, but in a longer term, in the sense that children learn to communicate about patterns, or they learn to solve problems in a way if you put some questions there, and learn to verbalize, and learn to different process skills. So
yeah, no, I really appreciate you bringing that up, and it takes us back to the capacity of the teachers. Can you engage teachers in this conversation in the sense of what is the short-term effect, what's the long-term effect? Efficiency is both time and effectiveness, and we need to balance those things. And so that's the kind of rich discussion you would want to see in a faculty, to find ways to have the short and long-term outcomes that you want, and the transferability, and some of the things that we know to be important, but it's hard to operationalize them.
That's true, yeah.
I think
And there's another thing concerning teachers, and that is that accompanying this kind of work, as in the example that Keith told us, this is quite, it has a high demand on the capacity of teachers to lead conversations with students. So how to, or which questions should they
Right.
or can they ask the children, and how can they get into a conversation that is meaningful for the student and is not too much led by the teacher, or that the students have their own, can oh, that's difficult in English. Well, students are quite independent in this kind of work.
Right.
Well, and that they can keep this independency and this responsibility for their own learning. So
yeah, very true. Well, it reminds me of another reality that I discovered over and over again in my career as a consultant and a teacher trainer and a supervisor, and that is the probability that teachers will teach in the way they were taught. And to break that cycle is hugely complex. And the other thing I used to say in my teacher training, I said, you as a group are probably not very well suited to be teachers. I would say this to teachers. And they would look at me like, well, that's rather insulting. So I was quick to explain that by that I mean the way schools were when you were a kid worked for you. So you're probably not in the best position to help students who struggle, because the fact that you're still in education, that you want to be a teacher, tells me that you liked school and you did well in school just the way it was. And the students that you're, in many cases with the populations that I was serving, in many cases the system didn't work well for them and it needed to be different. And so it's no wonder that some of us have been involved in education for 50 plus years. It's not surprising that it's been difficult to turn that ship, because there's a certain amount of inertia, a certain amount of momentum. And I think that's what to me was so exciting about Anissa, was to generate on a limited scale, a generation of teachers who could see it differently, could experience it differently, and who could persist in the innovation. And that's what has been missing in education in many contexts, whether it's Europe or all the places that things have been tried. You're working with a population of teachers who, by their very experience and by their very orientation, are more likely to perpetuate the old system than to thrive in a new system.
That's so true. The example of the that you gave, Dan, about the critical thinking skills that are embedded in the standards. If I can connect the button example, for example, one of the things that I learned, because I was teaching the old way too, so I had to go back to the classroom and be retrained for 3 years. You could imagine that. And then I was working with teachers that had the same experience I had, so it was a tough pull. But for the example with the buttons, one of the things I had to learn about was that the kids, putting them into groups was a lower level of thinking. It was called grouping. All they did was put into groups. And then a higher level that you gradually get to is what's called class inclusion, which is that, and it's more like hierarchies. So I have this box of buttons, and the largest classes, these are buttons. And then subclass would be blue, red, and green buttons. And a subclass would be green buttons with 2 holes, and green buttons with 3 holes or 4 holes, but they're green and they're all buttons. And so there's certain questioning you can do for kids that they can compare within a class, but they're not able to compare a subordinate class with a superordinate class. It's just, and it's not because it's just their developmental level. And if you gave them a test, it'd be counted wrong, for example, but you can't give them an F because they're not there yet. It's a whole different approach to assessment. So yeah. One of the examples, a horrible example, would be standing in a farm, and there's cows and pigs and geese and all kinds of stuff, and there's a bunch of flies around, and there's a great big ant mound with all these ants running around. And you're standing there, and you say to an adult or a child, you say, well, look at all this look at all these animals all over the place. Well, what do you think? Are there, in the whole wide world, are there more ants or are there more animals? And a lot of times the kids that don't have that will say, why do you ask such a silly question? Look at all the ants. Look at all the ants. Of course there's more ants than there are animals. Well, where are the animals? Well, they're there. They're flying. There's the cow over there, the horse. But look at these ants. And so when I would do teacher training and we would get that kind of a response, the teachers were in shock, because they knew that ants are an animal, and they also belong to the class of animals, but they couldn't hold ants and animals, the subordinate class and the superordinate class, in their mind at the same time and make a comparison. And then little by little, they would be able to do that. And then lo and behold, I'm trying to train teachers of doing adding and subtracting, right? Mathematics, arithmetic. And thanks to the Arabs who discovered the zero in India, we came up with this thing called the base 10 system. And this wonderful invention. I always have fun with the kids talking about the invention of the zero. Who would ever think of having a symbol for nothing? And not even the Romans could come up with that, or the Egyptians or the Greeks, right? So what it turns out is that the math standard is to be able to do math where you have double digits, and they have all these things, of how you do it, take subtraction up to the thousands or whatever. But what's embedded in there is that, oh my gosh, the base 10 system depends on understanding the class inclusion, because the tens contain the ones and the hundreds contain 10 tens and all the way up. And so to make this more concrete, I got base 10 blocks, right? And you could actually physically show kids what it means to borrow and to carry. And we would make up stories. We'd knock on the door and say, hey, I don't have enough of this. Would you give me one of your tens? And I would break it down into ones and bring it over to this column. It was a whole story. It was fun. And then I tried, and I had 12 teachers to teach that. And I would show them and say, here's some blocks, here's the columns, here's the ones that are now, show me how you do this addition problem with carrying with the blocks. And they would just look at me. I only had one out of 12 could show me the relationship between symbols and concrete objects. And they were in tears, some of them. And I said, don't cry, because that's the same way I was. I'll show you how to do this. Because the two of us, we were never taught this way. We just put a little digit up there and said, there, you carry this, and you cross out that, and you do it all on paper with digits, with symbols. But we didn't know how it connects to real concrete things. Yeah. So it was just this, but it was that same thing as like, and you can't even do this with kids. You can't just say, oh, look at this box of blocks, because they don't really understand the idea of class inclusion. They're not there yet, that there's thousands and tens and ones. They don't, in fact, the little ones, we found out, we couldn't even, I don't know if you're familiar with these blocks, but they have a 10 block and a 1 block and a 1,000 block. But the 10 block is just a rod with lines on it. And you would show them 10 little cubes, ones and 1 10, and you say, well, where is there more, here or there? And they would say, oh, the 10 ones is more than the 110, because look at how many there are, and they're all over the place. And you just kind of hold up this one little rod and tell me that they're the same, because they weren't there yet, because they're what Piaget says is their perception is stronger than their cognition. Yeah. At that point in their development. And later, I mean, he literally says that the cognition, the thinking part, comes on top of perception, if I can show it like this, and it conquers perception. Right. Well, and that's a process. But
it goes back to my example of the science class, where the student did not have a schema or a concept for gravity. And yes, embedded in this idea of teaching process skills is enriching schema, enriching the understanding of what's happening. And in our rush to cover, I emphasize the word cover rather than uncover, objectives, learning objectives, standards. If you can imagine, I think we actually spend less time now than we did 30 years ago on developing concepts and schema. I remember, just to give you a very vivid example, I know this is kind of what Karen was saying before about being a bit pessimistic, but I think it really brings the point home. I was observing an 8th grade math class years ago, and they were doing operations with negative integers, which has got to be one of the most bizarre things about mathematics. If you really think about what you're asking kids to do with operations with negative integers, it's pretty bizarre for non-mathematicians. And he was a long-term, he'd been in the district for a long time, and the principal thought he was a pretty good teacher. I just picked the wrong day to be there, because he got so frustrated with the students not able to do operations with integers. He said, okay, just stop asking questions. These are the steps. This is how you do it. Just do it. Yeah. The students wanted to understand the concept, and he got so frustrated in his inability to convey that he just said, follow the steps, follow the rules. And that happens more often than you might think. In your example about carrying and borrowing, or long division, there's a lot of reform efforts in mathematics, there have been for years, to develop concepts and procedures and schema in math. And so that's I know that's out there, and I worked with my math coordinator in the K-12 district, but there's always that tendency, when you put too much pressure on teachers to cover standards, that default position is, okay, this is the procedure, this is how you do it. And in the absence of a schema, guess what? no transferability.
There you go.
Mhm. Well, actually, maybe in some cases it's just important to be patient, because these blocks you were talking about, I think they are the precedents of it are the Montessori pearls. So Montessori invented these pearls, and she put them together also in so with stripes and plates and a cubic and so on, and then she taught children to count the pearls in these bigger entities, but the concept is the same. Yeah, it's the same possibility to discover and understand the decimal system. And Montessori is now some 100 years or 120 years ago. But I think the teachers that we educate, they know how to use all these materials. So maybe some 100 years later, it is arriving at schools. I hope so, at least, because I know all these your examples that teachers often stay with the procedures, and it happens also in our schools. But the young teachers, they know how important these materials are in order to understand what is happening, and the translations between different representations of, let's say, numbers or operations. That is something that is very important in math didactics today. So maybe things just take time, but nevertheless, I'm quite hopeful that this will get better in the future.
You know, I
That's
wanted
good.
to interject this, that Germany has a very, very long tradition of valuing critical thinking, of valuing philosophy, science, theology. And if you think about certainly the leading theologian in the Baha'i community for the entire 20th century was Dr. Udo Schäfer. No question about it. The man was a genius. And there's no surprise that he appeared in Germany. And the United States, we're a sort of funny country that has attracted people who were trying to get away from whatever they were made to do in someplace else, and do something differently. And we've become very in love with pragmatism, and very much convinced that the best thing is the quickest way to get something done. Not the best way to do it, but the quickest way, and the cheapest way, by the way, because we're looking at because that's profit for us, advancement, progress. It's all tied to speed and accuracy, but accuracy in the short term, and
Outcome.
and immediate outcomes. And we have the worst track record possibly in the entire world for teaching foreign languages to our students. It's
Don't get me started.
unbelievable. They're going to start in elementary school, and then they go all the way sometimes through college. They can't speak, they can't read or write in any other language. It's just, and I know that because I lived in France as a child. And the only French that I continued with and was able to build on was the French that I learned on the streets of the place I was living in France, because I took French classes all through, elementary school and high school, and I knew more French than my French instructor. That's how bad they were. Because they didn't understand. They could go through all the motions. They had all the textbooks, all of the testing, all of that stuff, but it never stuck. It never stuck because they were never trying to create competency. And competency is learned in an organic manner, and when it's organic, it sticks. And I'm reminded of this Sylvia Ashton Warner, and I don't know if that's a name that any of you recognize. She was from New Zealand, and she was teaching Maori children. And she found that the best way for her to teach English, which is the second language for Maori children, the best way to teach them English was to give them words that they wanted to know. Okay, words they could use immediately. And what she found was that if you give a child a word they want, they never forget it.
Wow. Super.
Right? So
Very
he
good.
had 5-year-olds writing stories at 5. Maori children writing stories in English at 5. And the reason why that was happening is because they were writing about something they were interested in, and they were writing using vocabulary that they had learned because it's something they wanted. And anyway, that was one of my sort of wake-up calls that the human mind works beautifully. We simply have to use it the way it's designed and not try to make it into something that it's not. And what it's not is any sort of a machine. It's not a machine. And when we treat it like a machine, well, my machine, I can put in certain data and then the machine will spout out whatever I put in. But the human being doesn't work that way, because if the human being as an individual is not interested enough in what you put in, they forget it. They forget it immediately.
Right.
Even if you give them a test right after you teach them something, they'll remember maybe 80%. And then if you gave them the same test 2 days later, it's 30%. that because there's no retention, because it wasn't interesting.
Right. Well, one of the few cultural universals is that human beings have the need to understand and explain what's going on in their environment. And that's one of the reasons that religion is a universal, language is a universal, customs and rights are universals. And it's very true what you're saying. It may sound on the face of it that when I talk about direct instruction of critical thinking skills, it may sound as if it's something imposed or outside the mind of the learner, but in fact, it creates order, it creates predictability, it creates confidence in learners because they know when they know and how they know it. And that's the power that you're talking about when it comes to language acquisition. That's why we know experientially and intuitively that if you want to learn a language, go where that language is used, where it's spoken. And that pragmatism, it's hard for some people to believe that teaching process skills is a pragmatic approach to teaching. But in fact, it is pragmatic. It's not esoteric. It's not optional. It's not beyond the reach of most learners. There is a pragmatism that is very observable and very predictable. One other thing I wanted to mention about the bigger picture, when I was teaching critical thinking at the university level, one of the things that I always started with was a quote from John Dewey, the grandfather of educational philosophy in the United States. And he said, "We do not learn from experience." My students would look at me like, "What are you talking about?" I like to provoke my students, my adult students, whenever I could. I said, Dewey said that we do not learn from experience. We learn from thinking about our experience. If you don't process, if you don't think about your experience, you're not going to learn. I said, have you ever known people who were married 3 or 4 times? Why did that happen? Just getting married over and over again does not mean that you know what that's all about. And so we would joke about it, but that the rest of my course was all about metacognition and thinking about thinking. And that's what process skills do for learners at any age. It equips them to think about their own thinking. And that's what empowers them to be lifelong teachers of themselves, lifelong learners, and critical thinkers that cannot be manipulated by others.
Bravo. Dan, this has been a really terrific opportunity to learn from you. I know Karen is going to speak. When are you speaking? Which day is it this week?
On Saturday.
On Saturday. And Keith is going to talk on Sunday
Is
or
it?
Monday. I don't
know.
he's on
I
the
think
30th.
it's-
He's on the 31st. I'm on the 30th. I don't know when else. I can't keep track of the schedule except for day by day. I'm trying to do that. But this has been really wonderful. And I personally have so many things I want to ask you. And so I'm hopeful that we will be doing this again within 6 months or a year. I want to make it a regular occurrence because we have so much to learn from each other. And not only us, there are, many people out there who, once this is on YouTube and it's on Facebook, they'll have access to it, and the word will get around, and people will be listening to you and learning from you.
Well, I think I can confidently speak for everybody, not just the few that were here today, but everybody else that's been involved so far, how much we appreciate your efforts, Peter.
Yes,
Well-
thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much, Dan, for this very interesting talk and this is a lot to think about, and I really wait for your book, and also nice to get to know you, Keith, and I look forward to the next evenings.
Likewise.
It's evening in Germany right now, so sorry.
I'm looking forward to it myself. Yeah. And thanks again, Dan. We reconnected again.
Yeah, it's
Good.
amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But anyway. We'll be
All
in
right, my
touch.
friends, we'll see you
Okay.
very soon, and have a nice sleep. Gute Nacht.
Oh, beautiful.
Bye bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.